I never imagined that saying yes to a simple favor would lead me down such a complicated and emotionally draining path. My name is Melissa Carter. I live in a quiet suburb just outside of Austin, Texas, with my husband Brian. We've been married for 8 years, and for most of that time, I believed we had a rock-solid relationship. But things began to shift when Brian got a new job working in construction management, a promotion that came with long hours, late nights, and, more importantly, a new group of friends who seemed to fill every inch of his free time. Brian had always been social, but this new group of buddies, Mike, Darren, and Ricky, were different. They were loud, intrusive, and had a way of making themselves at home no matter the situation. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just guys being guys. They'd come over on weekends, watch football, drink beer, and talk about their high school days even though they were all in their mid-30s. I would often cook for them, clean up after their messes, and try to be a good host, because that's just who I am. I was raised in a house where hospitality meant everything. But gradually, their behavior toward me started to change. It began subtly. A compliment here, an extra long stare there. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Darren, who was always the loudest, once made a joke about how Brian was lucky to have a wife like me who still looked like she was in college. I laughed it off, assuming it was just a harmless comment. But then Mike started offering to help out around the house whenever Brian wasn't home. One time, he showed up unannounced while Brian was still at work and offered to fix our leaky kitchen faucet. I didn't know how to say no without sounding rude, so I let him. But something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. It didn't stop there. Ricky was more reserved, but his eyes followed me constantly. At one of our cookouts, I caught him staring at me while I was bent over the grill, pretending not to notice, but his gaze made me deeply uncomfortable. I told Brian about it once, and he laughed, brushing it off as just how Ricky is. That was the beginning of the wedge between us. Brian didn't seem to take anything seriously anymore. If I brought up how uncomfortable his friends made me feel, I was being dramatic. If I stopped cooking for them or excused myself early from their hangouts, I was being rude. So I stayed silent, hoping things would settle down. They didn't. One night, Brian had to go out of town for a 2-day project inspection. Before leaving, he casually mentioned that Mike and Darren might stop by to borrow his truck. I didn't think much of it until they actually showed up. Not just to borrow the truck, but to hang out, have a few drinks, and make themselves comfortable in my home even while my husband was gone. I was wearing a simple oversized t-shirt and leggings, thinking I'd have a peaceful evening to myself. Instead, I found myself surrounded by 2 men whose intentions I no longer trusted. Mike poured himself a beer without asking. Darren kicked his shoes off and grabbed the remote like he owned the place. They talked loudly, joked inappropriately, and began commenting on how lonely the house felt without Brian. I kept my responses short and polite, hoping they would take the hint and leave. But they didn't. Instead, Mike asked if I'd join them for a drink. I declined. Then Darren asked if I wanted to play cards, something he knew Brian and I often did together. Again, I said no. Then something inside me snapped. I stood up and said, "You both need to leave. Now." They laughed at first, thinking I was joking, until they saw the look on my face. Darren scoffed, said something under his breath, and grabbed his coat. Mike gave me a long look before finally walking out the door. That night, I locked every window and slept with the bedroom door barricaded. When Brian got back the next day, I told him everything, how uncomfortable his friends made me feel, how they came over without notice, how they wouldn't leave when asked. His face darkened, but instead of being angry at them, he was angry at me. "Melissa, you're overreacting. They were just hanging out." "No, Brian. They weren't. They were invading my space. Our home. You're making this into something it's not." That argument lasted for hours. And when it ended, I realized something painful. Brian had chosen his friends over me. He didn't want to see what was happening because that would mean admitting he was wrong to bring them so deeply into our lives. I stopped talking to them completely after that. When they came over, I stayed in the bedroom. I stopped cooking for their get-togethers. I stopped being available. But the damage was done. Brian and I drifted further apart. We went from eating dinner together every night to passing each other like roommates. He spent more nights out than in, and I started to wonder who the stranger in my house was. Then, about a month later, something changed. I came home from work one evening to find Ricky waiting outside my house. He looked serious, nervous even. I almost turned around and left, but something about his face told me he wasn't here to continue the same pattern. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About the guys." I let him speak. He told me he'd seen the way they behaved. That he had heard the things Mike and Darren said about me when Brian wasn't around. That it wasn't just me imagining it, they were being inappropriate, and they thought it was funny. Ricky said he'd distanced himself from them after the last time, and that he felt guilty for not saying something sooner. "I think Brian knows," he added. "But he doesn't want to admit it because then he'd have to confront them." It was like a weight lifted off my chest and then dropped right back on. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was just alone in trying to set boundaries in a place that should have been safe. That night, I packed a small bag and went to stay with my sister. I left Brian a note. It wasn't dramatic. It simply said, "I need space. I don't feel safe in our home anymore." He called, texted, left voicemails. At first, he was angry. Then apologetic. Then angry again. But I didn't go back. I needed time to breathe, to think, to rediscover the version of myself that didn't walk on eggshells in her own house. Eventually, Brian asked if we could do counseling. I agreed, but only if he cut off contact with Mike and Darren. It took time, and tears, and a lot of effort. But slowly, we began to rebuild. He saw things he hadn't seen before. He admitted his fault in not protecting our space, in not listening when I needed him most. And I realized I had been holding in too much, afraid of looking like the bad guy when in reality, I was just trying to feel safe. Our marriage isn't perfect. But it's stronger now. The house feels like home again. And I learned that kindness doesn't mean allowing people to walk all over you. That setting boundaries doesn't make you rude, it makes you strong. Most importantly, I learned that no one should feel like a stranger in their own life.